you are climbing. The air is thin here, thinner than your lungs expect, and every few steps you have to stop and let the world settle. Below you, a valley falls away into blue distance. Above you, higher than seems reasonable, there are more mountains still, their peaks white and silent against the hard, clear sky. And yet you are not lost, you are on a road. It is a narrow ribbon of fitted stone cut into the side of the mountain by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. It runs level and sure where the slope drops away to nothing. In places it becomes a staircase in the rock. In places it crosses a gorge on a bridge woven out of grass, swaying gently over a river you can hear but cannot see. And along this road a young man is running. He runs the way only someone raised on these heights can run, easy and fast, and as he passes you he does not slow down. In his hand there is a bundle of colored cords, knotted along their length in a pattern you cannot read. He is carrying a message. He will run until his breath gives out, and then he will hand the cords to another runner waiting at a small stone house by the road, and that one will run, and the message will keep moving through the mountains at the speed of a sprint, day and night, for 1,000 miles. You follow the road with your eyes as far as it will go, and it does not stop. It climbs and turns and climbs again and vanishes over a shoulder of rock toward a horizon that belongs to somebody. All of this belongs to somebody. Every terrace carved into these impossible slopes, every bridge, every stone house, every storehouse full of grain against the winter, all of it is held together by a single hand, from a city you cannot see yet, hidden in a fold of the mountains ahead. Here is the strange part. The people who built this had no writing, not the way you mean it. They had no wheel to carry a load, no iron for their tools, no horses, no money, no markets. And with none of that, in the space of a single human lifetime, they built the largest empire the Americas would ever know. 4,000 miles of it, laid along the longest chain of mountains on earth. You already half remember them. A mountain city on a green ridge wrapped in cloud on 1,000 postcards. But that city is not the story. It is barely the edge of the story. The story is an empire that rose in one lifetime and fell almost entirely in a single afternoon. Tonight we climb into it while it still stands. Hello and welcome to Quiet History. This is a channel for the hour before sleep. One long true story told slowly, calm enough to drift off inside of. There is nothing here you need to stay awake for, so let it come to you gently. If these quiet nights help you, a like and a subscribe are what keep them coming. You can tap one now while your hands are still awake, and then set the phone aside for the night. Tonight, we are going high into the mountains, to the empire the Inca called Tawantinsuyu. The Inca you are picturing right now is probably a photograph. A city of grey stone on a green ridge, half wrapped in cloud, with a sharp peak rising behind it. Machu Picchu. It is one of the most beautiful ruins on earth, and later tonight we will go there, and I will tell you honestly what it really was, because it was not what the postcards say, and it was never lost. But the empire was so much larger than that one quiet ridge. At its height, it ran for about 4,000 miles down the spine of South America, from the edge of what is now Colombia, through Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia into Chile and Argentina. It held perhaps 10 or 12 million people. Its people called it Tawantinsuyu, a word that means, more or less, the four parts together, the single greatest empire the Americas ever produced. And it was one of the youngest empires in all of history. Rome took centuries to grow. The Inca did it in about 90 years. Tonight we are going to walk through it at its height and then follow it down into the dark. We will stand in the Golden Temple at its center and on the roads that held it together and among the terraces that fed it. We will look closely at the knotted cords the runner was carrying, and I will tell you honestly what they could and could not do. And we will follow the empire all the way to a small square in a mountain town called Cajamarca on an afternoon in November when 168 strangers changed everything. One thing before we begin, the same thing I always say. A great deal of what people believe about the Inca is either exaggerated or simply invented, sometimes by the people who conquered them, sometimes by explorers who wanted a better story. So part of what we are doing tonight is separating the empire that actually existed from the one that got remembered. That, as always, is the better story. So settle in. Turn the lights down low. We are going up into the thin, bright air of the Andes 500 years ago to the greatest empire of the mountains. Chapter 1. The Roof of the World. Before there were any Inca, there were the mountains. And to understand the Inca at all, you have to understand that they built everything they built in one of the least forgiving places human beings have ever chosen to live. The Andes are the longest mountain range on the surface of the earth. They run for more than 4,000 miles down the western edge of South America, a continuous wall of rock between the Pacific Ocean and the vast green interior. In many places, they rise straight up out of the sea and climb, in the space of 100 miles, to peaks higher than any mountain in Europe or North America. This is a landscape of extremes stacked on top of one another. Desert coast, then foothills, then high cold plateau, the Altiplano, where the air holds only about half the oxygen it holds at sea level, then snow and glaciers and thin blue nothing. Nothing about this place invites an empire. Empires like flat land, river valleys, plains you can plow and march across. The Andes offer almost none of that. What they offer instead is verticality. Here, the important distances are not east and west, but up and down. Walk downhill for a day and you pass through climates that in the rest of the world would be separated by thousands of miles. From frozen grassland where only tough tubers grow, down through cool valleys good for maize, down into warm slopes where you could raise peppers and coca and fruit. A single community could hold land at several of these heights at once and eat from all of them. The people of the Andes learned to read this vertical world the way a sailor reads the sea. They learned which crops belonged at which altitude. They learned to build flat shelves of soil, terraces, into slopes that had no flat ground at all. They learned to keep two animals that most of the world had never seen: the llama, tall and patient, that could carry a load along a mountain trail, and the alpaca whose soft wool became cloth finer than gold. And they learned, above all, to store. In a land of hard frosts and uncertain rain, the difference between a full storehouse and an empty one was the difference between a people and a memory. So the genius of the Inca did not come from nowhere. It came out of the mountains themselves. Everything they would later become famous for: the terraces, the storehouses, the roads that clung to the cliffs, the herds of llamas moving along them, all of it began as the ordinary, patient answer to a single question that every generation in the Andes had to answer again. How do you live and keep living in a place this high and this hard? Hold that question in your mind, because the empire we are about to build chapter by chapter is really just that same question, answered at the scale of a continent. Chapter 2. Before the Inca. There is a temptation with the Inca to imagine that they simply appeared, that they walked out of a cave one morning fully formed, invented everything, and conquered the mountains. It makes a clean story. It is also completely untrue, and the truth is more interesting. The Inca were the last in a very long line. People had been living in the Andes and along the desert coast for thousands of years before the first Inca was ever born, and some of them built things that would have astonished even the empire that came after. On the coast of what is now Peru, at a place called Canals, people raised great earthen pyramids and sunken plazas almost 5,000 years ago. Around the same time, the first pyramids were rising in Egypt, on the other side of the world, with no possible knowledge of one another. Later, in the high mountains, a culture we call Chavin drew pilgrims from far away to a temple full of strange carved gods and spread a way of seeing the world across the region without any army at all. Closer to the Inca, in time and in place, were the two great powers whose shadow they grew up in. One was Wari, a mountain state that built cities and, crucially, began to lace the highlands together with roads and administrative centers, the first rough sketch of the thing the Inca would later perfect. The other was Tiwanaku, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, high on the cold Altiplano, a city of monumental stone gateways and carved figures that stood for centuries as a center of religion and power. When the Inca later told stories about the beginning of the world, it was to Lake Titicaca and the ruins of Tiwanaku that they pointed. Even they looked back and saw something older and sacred. By the time the Inca themselves began to matter, around 800 years ago, these earlier powers had fallen, and the mountains had broken back up into a patchwork of small kingdoms and warring valleys. The Inca were, at first, simply one of these. A modest people in one valley around a small town that would one day be called Cusco. Nothing marked them out. If you had walked through the Andes at that time, you would have had no reason to notice them at all. So when we talk about Inca roads, Inca terraces, Inca storehouses, the knotted cords, even the idea of moving whole populations around to serve the state, we should be honest. The Inca did not invent most of these things. The ideas were already there, scattered through the mountains, worked out over thousands of years by people whose names we have mostly lost. What the Inca did was gather them. They took every good idea the Andes had ever produced, and they organized it and scaled it and drove it forward with a discipline no one before them had managed. That is a different kind of genius than invention. It is the genius of the builder who takes 1,000 separate stones and makes them, at last, into a single wall. To build that wall, they would need a story about where they came from. That story is where we go next. Chapter 3. The Legend of the First Inca. Every empire tells a story about its own beginning, and the Inca told a beautiful one. In the version that has come down to us, the world was still in darkness and disorder when the sun god, Inti, looked down on the people of the mountains living like animals, without order, without knowledge, and took pity on them. And so, from an island in the cold blue water of Lake Titicaca, he sent his children into the world to teach them. The first of these was a man named Manco Qhapaq, and with him his sister and wife, Mama Oclo. The sun gave Manco Qhapaq a staff of gold and told him to travel north until he found the place where the staff sank into the earth at a single push. There, and only there, he was to found a city. So the two of them walked, testing the ground as they went, through valley after valley, until at last, in a green high valley, the golden staff slid into the soil and disappeared. This was the sign. This was the center of the world. Here they would build. There is an older and stranger telling of the same beginning, and it is worth a moment. In it, the first Inca did not come out of the lake at all, but out of a cave at a place called Pacarictambo, the Inn of Dawn. From it stepped 4 brothers and 4 sisters, among them Ayar Kachi, Ayar Uchu, Ayar Oka, and Ayar Manco, who set out together with their people to find a home. And in the way of such stories, the brothers fell away one by one. One, too strong and too dangerous, was sealed back inside the earth. One was turned to stone upon a sacred hill, until only the last of them, Ayar Manco, came down at length into the valley of Cusco and became its first ruler, the same Manco Qhapaq, under another name. Whichever version you keep, the lake or the cave, the meaning underneath is the same. The Inca came from the sacred earth itself and were meant, from the very first morning of the world, to rule. Manco Qhapaq taught the men to farm, to build, to work the land in terraces. Mama Oklo taught the women to spin and to weave, and the city they founded in that valley they called Cusco. From it, in time, would grow everything. It is a lovely story. It is the kind of story a people tells when they have become powerful and need to explain why. A story that makes the empire not an accident of war, but a gift from the sun, planted deliberately at the center of the earth. Now let me tell you honestly what we can actually say. Archaeology has looked hard at the valley of Cusco, and it does not find a city that dropped out of the sky. It finds ordinary human history. Before the Inca proper, the same valley was home to people we call the Quilca, who lived there for centuries, built with stone, made their pottery, and were, in every visible way, the direct ancestors of the Inca who came after. There was no single miraculous founding. There was a long, slow settling, one people among many gradually growing into the place that would become their capital. So the golden staff and the children of the sun belong to the same shelf as the she-wolf who suckled the founders of Rome, or the gods who fathered the kings of Egypt. They are not history. They are what a civilization says about itself once it needs to feel chosen. And yet, and this matters, the legend was not a lie the Inca told other people. It was the truth they lived inside. When a Sapa Inca sat in Cusco and called himself the son of the sun, he believed it, and so did nearly everyone around him. The story was not decoration on the empire. In a real sense, it was the empire's foundation stone, more load-bearing than any wall. To understand why millions of people obeyed one man in a feathered crown, you have to understand that they and he believed the sun had chosen his family and planted his city at the center of the world. Which brings us to the city itself. Chapter 4. Cusco, the navel of the world. The name Cusco is usually said to mean the navel, the center, the place where everything is joined. And that is exactly what the Inca made it. Not the largest city they would ever hold, not the richest in people, but the heart. Every road in the empire ran, always, back to Cusco. Every noble family kept a house there. It was the place you came from and the place you returned to, the fixed point around which the whole four-cornered world turned. The Inca built Cusco to be read like a body. Later accounts tell us the city was laid out in the shape of a puma, the great mountain cat, with a river for its spine and, at the head, a vast fortress of stone whose zigzag walls formed the animal's teeth. Whether or not every citizen saw the puma when they walked the streets, the meaning was plain enough. This was a living thing, a predator, crouched at the center of the mountains. At the very heart of the city stood the temple the Inca called the Coricancha, a name that means simply the golden enclosure, and it earned it. The Spanish who saw it before it was stripped could barely describe it without sounding like liars. The walls, they said, were banded with plates of gold. There was a garden in which the plants, the maize, the flowers, the very soil were fashioned out of gold and silver, life-size, glinting in the mountain light. Inside were the images of the gods, and, kept with them, something stranger and more important than any statue, which we will come to later, the preserved bodies of the dead emperors themselves, seated in state, as though they had never quite left. Over all of it presided one man, the Sapa Inca. The phrase means something like the sole Inca, the unique one. He was not merely a king. He was held to be the living son of the sun, a descendant in an unbroken line from Manco Qhapaq. When he traveled, he was carried on a litter, and ordinary people were not permitted to look at his face. He ate from gold. What he wore once, he wore only once. The cloth was then burned, because nothing that had touched the son of the sun could be used again. Even the ground he had walked was, in some tellings, treated as holy. It is easy, from a distance, to see this as mere vanity. It was something colder and more useful than that. In a land with no writing to fix laws, no coins to move value around, no single common language among all its peoples, the Sapa Inca himself was the state. He was the thing that held the four parts together, a living center that everyone could believe in, sacred enough that his word did not need to be written to be law. The whole enormous machine we are about to describe, the roads and the storehouses and the armies, all of it ran, in the end, on the belief that this one man in Cusco was the son of the sun. For most of the Incas' early history, that man ruled over not very much. A single valley, a handful of neighbors, the ordinary quarrels of the mountains. And then, in one generation, everything changed. Because of a war, the Inca very nearly lost. Chapter 5. The Turning Point. For all its later glory, the Inca state spent its first 2 centuries as a small and unremarkable power. Its rulers fought their neighbors, won some, lost some, married into a few, and expanded slowly across a modest stretch of highland. If nothing else had happened, they might have stayed that way, a footnote among the mountain kingdoms, remembered by no one. What changed everything was an attack that should have destroyed them. Sometime around the year 1438, a powerful and aggressive people called the Chanca, who lived to the west, came for Cusco in force. This was not a border raid. This was an army marching to swallow the Inca whole. And by the accounts that survive, the Inca ruler of the day looked at the size of the Chanca host, decided the city could not be held, and did what many rulers have done at such a moment. He prepared to abandon Cusco and flee. But one of his sons refused to run. His name at that point was Kusi Yupanqui, and everything we know as the Inca Empire hangs on his decision to stay. He gathered what forces he could, rallied the men who would not abandon the city, and met the Chanca in the field. And against the expectation of nearly everyone, he won. The Chanca were broken, Cusco was saved, and the young man who had saved it was not about to hand the victory back to a father who had been ready to run. He took the throne, and he took a new name. From then on, he would be called Pachacuti, a tremendous word that means something close to he who overturns the world, or the turner of time. It was not modest, it was also, as it turned out, accurate. Because Pachacuti did not stop at saving Cusco. He seems to have understood, in a way no Inca before him had, that a state which merely defended itself would always be at the mercy of the next Chanca. So he went on the attack, and he did not stop. and he built the beginnings of a machine designed to keep conquering long after he was gone. He rebuilt Cusco itself in stone, grander than before, and it is to him that later tradition credits the great temple and much of the city's sacred shape. He reorganized the way conquered lands were governed. He is remembered as the ruler who set out the empire's whole system, its division into parts, its network of obligations, its way of absorbing new peoples rather than simply crushing them. And he sent his armies out, north and south along the mountains, further than any Inca ruler had ever dreamed. This is the answer to the promise we made at the very beginning, how an empire could be built in a single lifetime. It was built because one man, in one desperate afternoon, refused to run and then spent the rest of his life turning that refusal into a system. Pachacuti's son, Topa Inca, would carry the armies further still, south into Chile and north into Ecuador. His grandson, Huayna Capac, would push the borders to their furthest extent of all. But the shape of it, the engine of it, was Pachacuti's. In the space of 3 generations, a single threatened valley became 4,000 miles of empire. And there was a hidden engine driving that speed, stranger than any of it, and it grew straight out of the way the Inca treated their dead. When a Sapa Inca died, he did not, in the Inca mind, truly leave, and neither did his property. His palace, his lands, his herds, his servants, all of it stayed his forever, kept in his name by his descendants to maintain his body and his memory, which meant that a new emperor inherited the throne and the title and the armies, but not the wealth. He came to power land, rich in name and empty-handed in fact, surrounded by a dead predecessor's estate that he could not touch. And so, to build a household worthy of the son of the sun, to reward his followers and feed his court and leave an estate of his own, each new ruler had to do the one thing that would make him rich. He had to conquer new land. The dead held the old wealth. The living had to go out and win more. It was, in a sense, a machine for endless expansion, assembled almost by accident out of ancestor worship. And it is a large part of why the empire swelled across a continent in under 100 years, and why, short of the edge of the world, it could never quite bring itself to stop. The next question is the one that should trouble us. How do you actually hold 4,000 miles of mountains together with no writing, no money, and no wheel? That is where the real Inca genius begins. Chapter 6. 4 parts together. Conquering land is the easy part. Any determined army with enough men can take a valley. The hard part, the part that breaks most empires, is holding it year after year once the army has moved on. And here the Inca did something quietly brilliant. They called their empire Tawantinsuyu, the 4 parts together. From Cusco at the center, the land was divided into 4 great quarters, 4 suyus, reaching out along the mountains toward the 4 directions. Each was governed in the name of the Sapa Inca by men of the highest rank, and beneath them a whole ladder of officials descended, level by level, all the way down to the men responsible for a mere handful of households. It was an administration built like a pyramid, each level answering to the one above, and all of it at the very top, answering to the son of the sun in Cusco. But structure alone does not keep a conquered people loyal. What made the Inca system unusual was what they did when they took a new land. They did not, as a rule, simply burn it and enslave the survivors. Where they could, they preferred to absorb. When the Inca armies arrived at the edge of a new kingdom, they often came first with an offer. Join us, keep your fields and much of your daily life, and share in the wealth and protection of the empire. Many chose to accept rather than be destroyed, and those who accepted were folded in. Their local lords were frequently left in place, now working for Cusco. Their gods were not necessarily thrown down. Sometimes the most important local idols were carried respectfully to Cusco and kept there, honored and also quietly held hostage, so that a rebellious province would be rebelling against its own captured gods. And where a people was thought too dangerous or too stubborn, the Inca had a more drastic tool. They would move them. Whole communities could be uprooted and marched to a distant part of the empire, and loyal populations settled in their place. A rebellious valley, scattered among strangers 1,000 miles from home, surrounded by people who owed everything to Cusco, was a valley that could not easily rebel again. It was a hard policy and a clever one, and it stitched the empire together out of peoples who had never chosen to be one. Binding all of it was a single official language. The Inca spread the tongue we now call Quechua as the language of administration across the whole empire, over the top of dozens of local languages. A governor from the far north and a governor from the far south, meeting in Cusco, could understand one another. It was the empire's connective tissue, and it worked so well that Quechua is still spoken today by millions, 5 centuries after the empire that spread it fell. So the 4 parts held together not by fear alone, but by a whole web of arrangements. Shared language, absorbed lords, hostage gods, resettled peoples, and above all, a promise. Serve the empire, and the empire will feed you when the harvest fails, clothe you, and carry you through the hard years. It was, in its way, one of the most complete systems of control ever built. But a system like this is not offered so much as imposed. And to impose it, the Inca first had to be able to make war. Their way of doing that was as strange and as distinctive as everything else about them. Chapter 7. The Art of Conquest. The Inca did not build the largest empire in the Americas by asking politely, but neither did they build it, most of the time, by fighting. The truth of Inca conquest sits somewhere in between, and it tells you a great deal about how their minds worked. When the armies of Cusco approached the new land, they usually came first, not with spears, but with an offer. Envoys would go ahead to the local lord and lay the choice before him plainly. Join the empire, keep your fields, keep much of your daily life, keep often your own position as lord, now under Cusco, and share in the gifts, the protection, and the full storehouses of the greatest power in the mountains, or refuse and face the alternative. And behind the envoys, in plain sight, stood the alternative, an army of tens of thousands, disciplined, well-fed, and in no hurry at all. A great many lords, looking at that army and that offer, chose to join. This was not cowardice, it was arithmetic. And it was, in truth, the Inca's most powerful weapon, the reputation that made a battle unnecessary. Whole provinces were folded into the empire with barely a blow struck, because the price of refusal was too plain to ignore. But when a people did refuse, the Inca made war, and they made it at a scale the mountains had never seen. Their armies were raised, like everything else, through the Mita, the labor term, so that a single campaign could call up tens of thousands of men from across the provinces, each district sending its share. These were not, for the most part, professional soldiers. They were ordinary men serving their turn, stiffened by a corps of hardened officers and led, at the very top, sometimes by the Sapa Inca himself. Their weapons would look strange on a European battlefield. The Inca had no iron and no swords as we picture them, no cavalry and no bow as their main arm. What they had perfected. The sling, humble as it sounds, was a fearsome thing in Andean hands, a whirl of cord that could throw a stone hard enough to crack a helmet or break a bone across a startling distance, and the mountains were full of men who had used one since they could walk. For closer work there was the mace, its head a star of stone or bronze, made to shatter armor and skull, and clubs and spears, and the bolas, weighted cords flung to tangle a running man's legs. For defense, quilted cotton armor thick enough to turn a stone or a blade, and shields of wood and hide, and helmets of cane and wood. It was a way of war built for the mountains and for mass. And mass is the word. Inca battles were not duels of champions. They were the collision of huge bodies of men, opening with clouds of sling stones and spears, and closing into a crush of clubs and maces, with drums pounding and conch trumpets braying, and the war songs rising to shake the enemy's nerve before the lines even met. Some of those drums and trumpets, it was said, were made from the bodies of the most hated enemies, a deliberate horror meant to break a man's will before the fighting reached him. Discipline and numbers were the Inca weapons above all. That, and the one thing no other army in the region could match. Because the true Inca weapon was not the sling, it was the road and the storehouse. An Inca army marched along the great highways, slept in the tambo, and ate from the colca, the storehouses stocked in advance all along the route. While an enemy's warriors had to break off and go home to plant or harvest or starve, the Inca army did not. It could stay in the field, supplied and fed and rested, for as long as the campaign required. An empire that never went hungry could simply outlast almost anyone. The logistics we admired in the roads and the storehouses were, first of all, a machine for war. And when the fighting ended, the Inca were as careful in victory as in the field. Defeated warriors were often folded into the empire's own armies. Conquered lords were confirmed in their places or replaced with loyal men, and their heirs were carried off to Cusco to be raised in Inca ways and Inca loyalties. The most sacred idols of the beaten people were taken to the capital and honored there, and held. And where a people had fought too hard, or seemed too dangerous to trust, they were broken up and resettled, marched away, and scattered among strangers, as we have already seen. So the empire grew by threat where it could, by battle where it must, and by absorbing, always absorbing, everyone it beat. It is worth being honest about what this means. The gentle-seeming machine of roads and storehouses and reciprocity was, at its foundation, backed by one of the most formidable military systems the Americas ever produced. The velvet was real. So was the iron underneath it, even if the iron here was stone and bronze and the endless discipline of men. There is one last thing to notice and to hold on to for later. This magnificent war machine had a single weakness built into its very heart. It was designed to point outward at enemies beyond the border. In all its short life, it had never once been turned against itself. On the day two brothers each seized a piece of it and pointed it inward, the same machine that had built the empire would take it apart with terrible efficiency. But that wound is still years away. So the army was the empire's fist. It was not, however, the empire's purse. Because the strangest thing about this conquering people is that they ran the whole of it, armies and all, on no money at all. Chapter 8. The Empire with No Money. Try, for a moment, to imagine running a country without money. No coins, no banknotes, no markets in the way we understand them. No place where you carry your surplus grain to trade for cloth or sell your labor for a wage. No prices, nothing you could put in a purse. For almost every large society in history, money is the water the whole thing swims in. It is how value moves from one hand to another across distance and time. The Inca held together an empire of 10 million people, and they did it, essentially, without any of that. What they had instead was labor, and an idea about labor so deeply rooted that it shaped everything. In the Andes, the oldest unit of society was the Ayllus, a kind of extended family or clan, a group of households bound by kinship who held land in common and worked it together. And the Ayllus ran on a principle called reciprocity. If I help you build your house today, you help me with my harvest next month. If your family is in need, mine gives, knowing that ours may need in turn. Giving and receiving back and forth was not charity. It was the thread that held people together, and it carried an obligation as binding as any debt. The genius of the Inca, or perhaps their ruthlessness, depending on where you stood, was to take this small human village-scale idea and stretch it to the size of an empire. The state became, in effect, one enormous Ayllus, with the Sapa Inca at its head. And the debt every subject owed was paid not in money, but in work. This was the system called Mita, a word meaning, roughly, a turn. Every able household owed the empire a turn of labor each year. You might spend it farming the land set aside for the state and the gods. You might spend it building a stretch of road, a terrace, a storehouse, a temple. You might serve in the army or carry messages or work in the mines or, if you had a rare skill, weave fine cloth or work gold for the court. The turn was owed by rotation so that no one family bore it forever, and while you served, you were fed and housed from the state stores. You were not paid because there was nothing to be paid with. You were instead discharging your share of the great reciprocity that bound the whole empire together. And in return, the empire gave something genuinely valuable. It gave security against hunger. Everywhere across the mountains, the Inca built storehouses, the Cualca. Row upon row of them, on hillsides above the towns, stone chambers built to keep grain and dried potatoes and cloth and weapons cool and dry for years. Into them went the harvest from the state's lands, the tribute of labor turned into stored food, and out of them, in a hard year, a failed harvest, a hard frost, a war, came relief. The Inca could feed the stricken province, or supply an army on the march, or clothe the whole town, out of stores that stretched, in places further than the eye could follow. To a farmer in the mountains, where a single bad winter had always meant the edge of starvation, this was not a small thing. It may have been the most persuasive argument the empire ever made. So the Inca economy was not built on buying and selling. It was built on obligation and storage, on millions of turns of labor flowing up to the state, and food and security flowing back down. It was, arguably, one of the largest experiments in central planning the world had ever seen, 500 years before anyone had the words for it. And to run it, to know who owed a turn, and who had served, and how much grain sat in which storehouse, in which distant valley. The Inca needed to count, and to record, and to remember across 4,000 miles. They did it famously without writing, almost. And that is the puzzle we turn to now. Chapter 9. The Knotted Cords. Come back for a moment to the runner from the very beginning, the young man sprinting along the cliff road with a bundle of colored cords in his hand. Those cords are the great riddle of the Inca, and they are the answer to the question we have been circling since the start. How do you run an empire this size with no writing? The cords are called Quipu, sometimes spelled Quipu. A Quipu is a set of strings. There is a main cord, and hanging from it are many smaller cords, and from some of those, smaller ones still, so that a large Quipu looks a little like a mop, or the roots of a plant, or a strange tasseled necklace. And all along these hanging strings are knots, tied at different heights, in different forms, in cords dyed different colors and spun in different directions. To us, it looks like decoration or a tangle. To the Inca, it was a record. What we understand best is the numbers. The Inca used a counting system based, like ours, on tens, and they recorded numbers on the Quipu with a precise and consistent grammar of knots. The position of a knot along the string told you its value, units near the bottom, then tens, then hundreds, then thousands, climbing up the cord. The kind of knot mattered. With this system, a trained official could record any number, however large, quickly and unambiguously, and another trained official in a different city could read it back exactly. Populations, herds, the contents of a storehouse, cord by cord, the men a province owed in labor, and the men it had sent, an empire's worth of accounts held in knotted string. The people who made and read these were specialists, the Quipucamayos, the keepers of the Quipu, a trained class of record keepers stationed throughout the empire. They were the empire's memory. When Cusco wanted to know how many fighting men a distant valley could raise, or how much grain sat in its stores, a Quipucamayo consulted his cords and gave the answer. It was a census, a treasury, and an archive, carried in a bundle you could sling over one shoulder and run with along a mountain road. Now here is where honesty matters, because this is one of the great open questions about the Inca, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. For the numbers, we are fairly confident, but the Quipu seem to have carried more than numbers. The Spanish who arrived recorded that Inca officials could read histories and messages and even songs from their cords, things that are not simply counts of things. For a long time, most scholars assumed this was memory as much as record, that the knots jogged the reciter, the way a knotted handkerchief reminds you of an errand, while the real story lived in his head. But that view has been shaken. In recent years, the anthropologist Sabine Hyland, working in a remote Andean village called San Juan de Colata, was allowed to examine a pair of Quipu that the community had guarded as sacred heirlooms for generations. And she argued that these are not counting cords at all, but something far closer to writing, that their colors, their fibers, and the very direction in which each strand is spun may stand for the sounds of language itself, syllable by syllable. The Colata chords on this reading are letters tied in string. If she is right, then the Inca and their heirs were not quite the great people without writing after all. They may have had a writing all along, one we have simply never learned to read. The truth, for now, sits honestly in between. The Inca had no writing of the kind you are reading these words in, but they were very far from a people who kept nothing. They ran a continent-sized state on knotted string and forgot almost nothing they needed to remember. And whether those chords whispered actual words or only numbers and the shape of a story is a question the mountains have not finished answering. The chords held the empire's memory, the roads carried it, and it is out onto those roads that we go next. Chapter 10: The Roads. If the Quipu were the empire's memory, the roads were its blood. The Inca built a road network so vast that even now, laid end to end, it is hard to hold in the mind. Something on the order of 40,000 kilometers of constructed road, the length of the whole thing folded back and forth across the mountains many times over. They called the great trunk of it the Qhapaq Ñan, the royal road, or beautiful road. Two main highways ran the length of the empire, one along the high mountains, one down the desert coast, and between and around them ran a web of lesser roads binding every province back to the center. And remember what they built it without. No wheel, because a wheel is useless on a staircase cut into a cliff, and they had no animal big enough to pull a cart in any case. No iron. The roads were not made for carts at all. They were made for feet, and for llamas, for people walking, and for trains of pack animals stepping carefully along the stone. Where the mountain allowed, the road was a paved way, walled at the edges, ditched to carry off the rain. Where the slope was too steep to walk, it became a staircase, hundreds and hundreds of stone steps climbing straight up the face of the mountain. Where the land was marshy, it ran along a raised causeway, and where a gorge cut the road in two with a river roaring far below, the Inca did the thing that most astonished the people who came later. They bridged it, not with stone, but with grass. They wove suspension bridges out of twisted mountain grass, thick cables of it braided together into ropes as thick as a man's body, anchored to stone towers on either side of the chasm and hung with a walkway between. These bridges swayed, and they frightened the Spanish half to death, and they held. Each was rebuilt regularly by the communities nearby as part of their labor turn, the old ropes replaced with new before they could rot. A bridge that was, in a sense, alive, renewed year after year by the hands of the people it served. One of them is still rebuilt this way every year by the descendants of the people who first strung it across the river. Grass and knots holding up human beings over a 500-foot drop 5 centuries on. Along the roads, at intervals of a day's travel, stood the tambo, way stations, storehouses, and shelters where a traveler on the empire's business could rest, eat from the state stores, and sleep. And along the roads ran the messengers we began with, the chesky. These were young runners, posted in pairs at little houses set close together all along the great highways. A chesky would run at full speed to the next station, calling out or handing over his message, a spoken report, or a quipu, or a small precious object, and a fresh runner already waiting would seize it and sprint on, and so the message would fly through the mountains in an unbroken relay, day and night, faster than any single runner or rider could have carried it. By this means, it is said, news could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, and fresh fish from the distant coast could reach the Sapa Inca's table in Cusco, high in the mountains, still fit to eat. Stop for a moment and picture the life of one of those runners. High on a bare shoulder of the mountain, in a little stone hut, the Inca called a chasquiwasi. 2 young men wait. It is bitterly cold, and the wind never quite stops, and there is nothing to do but watch the road and keep a small fire alive. They wait through the long afternoon and into the dark and through the freezing night, listening. And then, far off, a call. The next runner coming in. One of them is up and out into the cold before he is even fully awake, falling into step to take the chords or the words, already moving, already gone, while the other settles back to keep the fire and wait his own turn. All along 4,000 miles of mountain road, in hundreds of these tiny huts, boys are waiting in the cold for a voice on the wind. That was the nervous system of the empire. Not wires, not writing, but young men awake in the dark, ready to run. Think about what that means altogether. An empire 4,000 miles long, with no writing to send ahead of you and no horse to carry you, run at the speed of a relay of running men. The roads were how Cusco's will reach the edges of the world, and how the edges of the world reported back. Cut the roads, and the empire would go blind and deaf and fall to pieces. Hold them, and one man in one mountain city could feel the pulse of a continent. But roads and bridges are only the empire's arteries. To feel its full weight, you have to look at the thing everyone remembers it for, the stone. Chapter 11. Stone. Of everything the Inca left behind, It is the stonework that still stops people where they stand. Walk through the old streets of Cusco today, 5 centuries after the empire fell, and you will find yourself moving between walls that the Inca laid. They are made of enormous blocks of stone, some as tall as a person, some far larger, and they are fitted together without any mortar at all. No cement, no clay, nothing between them. And yet the joints are so precise that, in the famous phrase, you cannot slide the blade of a knife between two stones. The blocks are not square either. They are irregular, many-sided, each one shaped to lock against its neighbors like an impossible puzzle, and the whole wall leans very slightly inward as it rises. Above Cusco stands the greatest example of all, the great terrace complex the Inca called, in their language, a name the Spanish wrote down as Sacsayhuaman. Here the stones are simply enormous. The largest weigh well over 100 tons, the weight of many houses, and they are cut and fitted with the same flawless precision as the small ones, their curved faces meeting so exactly that the seams almost disappear. To stand before those walls is to feel your sense of the possible quietly rearranged. And here, again, remember what they did not have. No iron tools to cut the stone, no wheel to move it, no draft animals to haul it, no cranes, no pulleys, no machines of any kind. So how? Not by magic, though people have reached for magic and for lost civilizations and for stranger things still, to explain these walls. The honest answer is less mysterious and, I think, more impressive, because it is human. They did it with stone and bronze tools, with harder rocks used to pound and shape softer ones patiently over enormous spans of time. They did it with ramps of earth and with levers and with ropes, and above all with the one resource the empire had in almost unlimited supply: organized human labor, thousands of hands, moving and shaping and fitting under the direction of masters who understood stone the way a sailor understands the wind. What looks impossible is really the Mita made visible, the labor turn of an entire empire poured into rock. And the strangest thing about those tight, mortarless joints is that they were not only beautiful, they were wise. This is a land of earthquakes. When the ground heaves, a rigid mortared wall cracks and comes down. But an Inca wall of interlocked stones, fitted dry and leaning slightly inward, can move. The blocks shift against one another as the earth shakes, and then settle back into place when it stops. Spanish churches built on top of Inca foundations have fallen in earthquakes, while the Inca stonework beneath them stood unmoved. The people who fitted those stones were not only artists. They were engineers who had learned over generations exactly how a mountain likes to shake and built for it. The stone is where the Inca feel closest to us and furthest away at once. Closest, because we can see the marks of the hands and the patience. Furthest, because almost no one now would have the will or the time or the shared belief to move 100-ton stone up a mountain by hand and set it perfectly in a wall meant to last forever. That will came from the same place everything else did, from an empire that could summon the labor of millions and a people who believed the work was owed. But an empire cannot eat stone. Before we go any higher, we have to answer the most basic question of all. In a land this high and this hard, how did the Inca feed 10 million people? Chapter 12: Terraces and the Potato. Here is the problem. You have an empire of perhaps 10 or 12 million people living in some of the steepest country on earth, where flat farmland is almost non-existent and a hard frost can come at almost any time of year. How do you feed them all, year after year, with no famine bad enough to bring the whole thing down? The Inca answer, like so many of their answers, was patient, ingenious, and built one stone at a time. First, they made flat land where there was none. All across the mountains, the Inca and the peoples before them cut the slopes into terraces. The Andeans, long stepped shelves of level ground held up by stone retaining walls, climbing the hillsides like a giant staircase. Behind each wall, the builders laid a careful cross-section of the earth, coarse stone at the bottom for drainage, then gravel, then good soil on top, so that water soaked through slowly instead of washing the whole thing away. The terraces turned useless slopes into farmland, held the soil against the rain, and did something subtler as well. The stone walls soaked up the sun's heat by day and released it at night, warding off the frost, so that crops could be grown higher and later than the bare mountain would ever have allowed. In some places, the Inca even seemed to have built terraces as testing grounds, whole sunken rings of them at different depths and temperatures, as if experimenting with what would grow where. They had, in the potato, one of the great gifts of the Andes to the world. We think of the potato now as ordinary, but it began here, in these mountains, where over centuries the people had coaxed a poisonous little wild tuber into hundreds of varieties, each suited to a different height and soil and season. The potato would grow where maize could not, high and cold, and it fed the empire from below the ground. The Inca grew maize too in the warmer valleys, sacred and prized, brewed into the thick beer called chicha that flowed at every festival. They grew quinoa and peppers and squash, and down in the warm country, coca whose leaves chewed dulled hunger and cold and the thin ache of the high air. But the true masterstroke was what they did with the potato after the harvest. Up on the cold high plateau, the Inca laid the potatoes out in the open, where the hard night frost froze them through and the bright day sun thawed them, and the people trod out the water with their feet, over and over, freezing and thawing and pressing, until what remained was chuño, a light, dry, shriveled thing that looked like nothing and lasted almost forever. Freeze-dried potato, made with nothing but the mountain's own cold and heat. Chuño could be stored for years, carried by armies, held in the great Colca storehouses against the bad seasons. It was, in effect, how the Inca banked food against the future, and it is a large part of the reason the empire could gather armies and workers by the thousand and know it could feed them. So the terraces and the potato are the quiet foundation under everything else we have talked about. The gold, the roads, the stone, the armies, none of it would have been possible without the plain, unglamorous certainty that the storehouses were full and the people would eat. An empire marches, when it comes to it, on chuño and knotted string. We have built the machine now, the center, the roads, the record, the stone, the food. But there was one more thing a farmer in the mountains had to know, beyond what to plant and where. He had to know when, and for that, the Inca did not look down at the soil. They looked up. Chapter 13. The Year and the Sky. Here is a question that sounds simple and is not. In a land with no written calendar, no printed almanac, no book of any kind, how does an empire of 10 million people know when to plant? It matters more than almost anything. Plant too early on the high plateau and the frost kills the seed. Plant too late and the harvest is caught by the cold before it ripens. Across an empire stacked in vertical climates, where the right moment shifts from valley to valley and height to height, getting the timing right was, quite literally, the difference between a full storehouse and a famine. And the Inca solved it the way they solved everything, patiently, cleverly, and without a single written word. They watched the sky. Cusco itself was built to be a kind of observatory. From the golden temple at its heart, the Coricancha radiated a set of invisible lines the Inca called the Sique, dozens of lines running out across the land to hundreds of sacred places, springs and stones and shrines, ordering not only the holy sites but the kin groups who tended them, and, woven all through it, the turning of the ritual year. And on the hills around the city along the horizon stood pillars of stone. As the sun rose and set through the year, it moved along that skyline, and when it rose or set behind a particular pillar, seen from a fixed place in the city, the watchers knew the season had turned. It was a calendar written not on paper, but on the horizon itself, the sun, the skyline, and a line of standing stones. They tracked the great turning points of the sun, the solstices, with special care. At the June solstice, when the sun stood furthest and weakest and the high country was at its coldest, came the empire's greatest festival, Inti Rami, the feast of the sun, days of ceremony and offering to beg the sun to turn back and return, as he always reassuringly did. The priests kept account of the year against these marks and tied to it a calendar of months, each with its own festivals and its own labors. A month for breaking the ground, a month for sowing, a month for the ripening maize, a month for the harvest, so that the whole empire moved through the year in a single shared rhythm. They watched more than the sun. High in the clear Andean night, the Inca watched the Pleiades, the little knot of stars they knew as the storehouse, and it is one of the quiet marvels of their astronomy that they read in it the coming of the rains. When the cluster rose bright and sharp before the dawn at the right time of year, it promised a good season. When it rose dim and blurred, the wise ones warned that the rains would come late and the planting should wait. We now understand that a hazy sky in those particular weeks really can signal the kind of high moisture that foretells a poor rainy season, which means that the Inca, watching a smudge of stars for guidance on when to plant, were reading a true signal in the heavens centuries before anyone on earth could have explained why it worked. They read the dark of the sky as well as its lights. Where other peoples drew their constellations by joining the bright stars, the Inca also saw shapes in the dark clouds that drift across the glowing band of the Milky Way, which they knew as a great river in the sky. In those dark patches they saw a llama, a fox, a serpent, a toad, a whole world of animals written in shadow across the heavens and bound up with the seasons and the rains and the water on which every living thing depended. All of it, the sun on the horizon pillars, the solstice feasts, the storehouse of stars, the dark shapes in the celestial river, added up to something an empire could actually use. It was an almanac held in the trained memory of the priests, checked against the stone and the sky and, very likely, recorded in the knots of the Quipu, telling every district when to break the ground, when to sow, when to bring in the harvest, and when to feast. No book. No writing, only the oldest text there is, read by people who had learned it by heart. We have built the machine now, the center, the armies, the roads, the record, the stone, the food, and the sky that timed it all. So let us step down, at last, off the heights of statecraft and walk for a while among the people who lived inside it. Chapter 14. A Day in the Empire. Let us leave the emperors and the armies for a while and become, for one ordinary day, a farmer in a mountain village near the middle of the empire. It is the surest way to feel what all of this was actually for. You wake before the light in a house of stone and thatch, one of a cluster of houses belonging to your ailu, your kin. You do not own your fields as a person might today. The land belongs to the ailu and is shared out among the families according to need. More when your children are small and hungry, less when they have grown. Part of what you grow is yours to keep. Part is owed to the state and the gods. and part of your year is owed as labor, your turn, the Mita, though today is not one of those days. Today you climb to your own terraces in the thin morning cold, with your family beside you, and you work the earth with a foot plow, breaking the ground the way your parents did and theirs before them. You have almost nothing that we would call money, and you need almost none. What you cannot grow or make, the web of reciprocity provides. A neighbor's help today for your help tomorrow, and behind it all the distant promise of the storehouse if the harvest fails. Your wealth, such as it is measured in other things. In your herd of llamas and alpacas, if you are lucky enough to have one, and above all in cloth. It is hard now to understand how much the Inca prized fine cloth. To them it was more precious than gold. Gold was beautiful, but cloth was value itself. The finest weaving, made of the softest alpaca wool in patterns of astonishing skill, was the great gift of the empire, given by the Sapa Inca to reward loyalty, burned as an offering to the gods, wrapped around the bodies of the honored dead. In your own home, the women spin almost constantly wherever their hands are free, and a length of good cloth is a thing of real worth, saved and treasured and given at the great moments of a life. But the very finest cloth of all, the cloth fit for the gods and for the emperor, was not woven in homes like yours. It was made by a class of women set entirely apart from ordinary life, the Aclla, the chosen women. Across the empire, officials selected the most promising young girls and took them from their villages to live in enclosed houses in Cusco and the provincial capitals, cut off from the world outside. There they were raised to a life of sacred service, to weave the exquisite cloth the empire ran on, to brew the maize beer, the chicha, that was poured out at every great ceremony, and to tend the rites of the sun. Some were later given by the emperor in marriage to men he wished to honor. Some served the temples for the rest of their lives, and a very few at the empire's most solemn moments were chosen for the mountains, and we will come to them. It was at the same time a genuine honor and a life that was never freely chosen for rather than by. It is a quiet reminder that behind the empire's most beautiful and most sacred things stood the ordered, hidden labor of women whose names we have almost entirely lost. The day passes in work and in company. At midday you rest and eat, boiled potatoes perhaps and toasted maize, and if it is a festival, a cup of the thick maize beer, chicha, passed around and poured first, always, a little onto the earth, for the earth is Pachamama, the mother, and she is owed her share before you take yours. You chew a few coca leaves against the hunger and the height. Your children are counted like everyone. In the great census, the officials keep on their knotted cords, sorted by age and ability, so the empire knows exactly what it has, how many workers, how many soldiers, how many mouths. You will likely marry within a system the state itself helps to order, for even marriage in the empire is not entirely a private thing. You will owe your turns of labor across your life, and in return you will never, if the empire keeps its promise, face the old terror of the mountains alone, the failed harvest, the killing frost, the winter with nothing in the house. That is the bargain. Your freedom, in our sense, is small. Your security, by the standard of the age, is remarkable. And over all of it, giving it shape and meaning, is a sky full of gods, and a sun that is not a symbol but a living father to the man who rules you. To understand the day you have just lived, you have to understand what the people of the Andes believed about the world. And the surest way into that belief is not through a temple or a prayer, but through a metal, the one we now count as money, and they did not count as money at all. Chapter 15. The Sweat of the Sun. There is one more thing you must understand about the day you have just lived. and it is the thing that would, in the end, help to destroy the empire, though no one alive could have guessed it. We said that a farmer's wealth was measured in cloth, in llamas, in the reciprocity of kin. Notice what was not on that list: gold. In all the ordinary business of Inca life, gold was not wealth at all, because it was never money. It could not be. There was nothing to spend it on, and nowhere to spend it, and no one, from the highest lord to the poorest farmer, thought of it as riches in the way that we, 5 centuries later, cannot help but do. To the Inca, gold was something else entirely. It was sacred. They called it, in a phrase that tells you everything, the sweat of the sun. Gold was the sun's own substance, sweated out and left in the earth, and it belonged therefore to the sun and to the sun's living son, the Sapa Inca. Silver, in the same way, was the tears of the moon. These metals were not for trade. They were for the gods, and for the God who ruled among men. And so the Inca poured their astonishing skill in metal into the service of the sacred. Their goldsmiths were among the finest the ancient Americas ever produced, and in the Inca way, many of the very best of them were not Inca at all, but master metalworkers of the conquered coastal peoples, gathered up and resettled in and around Cusco to work for the empire and its gods. What their hands made was not coin or bar, but the body of a religion made visible. The walls of the great temple in Cusco were banded with gold to catch the light of the very sun the temple honored. Remember the garden of the Coricancha, where the maize and the flowers and the soil itself were fashioned in gold and silver, a field that would never wither because it was made of the sun and the moon. There were golden discs and masks and vessels and images of the gods, worked with a delicacy that stunned everyone who later saw them. And when the great died, gold went with them, into the tombs, onto the wrapped bodies of the mummies, kept forever because it was never, ever to be spent. Because it was not money, gold did not flow and scatter the way money does. It gathered. It piled up in the temples and the palaces and around the preserved bodies of the dead emperors, who kept their gold as they kept their lands and their servants, for the dead did not depart. The empire grew slowly heavier with sacred metal, almost none of it moving, all of it holy. Now hold that picture beside another people already on their way, for whom gold was the one thing worth crossing an ocean and killing for, gold that was money, purely and simply the measure and the object of all desire. Two peoples were about to look at the same yellow metal and see two completely different things. To the one, it was wealth itself, the whole reason for the voyage. To the other, it was the sweat of the sun, the flesh of a god, not to be bought or sold by anyone. Almost nothing that happened between them afterward can be understood without this single, terrible misunderstanding. When the strangers later melted the golden garden of the Coricancha into bars to be weighed and stacked and shipped across the sea, they believed they were carrying off treasure. To the Inca who watched, they were melting down the sun. But that is still to come. For now, simply hold the thought. To the Inca, gold was not wealth, it was the sun made solid, and to understand that is to understand everything they believed. So we turn now to the sun and to the dead. Chapter 16. The Sun and the Dead. The Inca lived in a world that was crowded with the sacred. To them, the divine was not shut away in a single temple or a single book. It was spread across the whole land, in the sun and the moon and the stars, in mountains and springs and strange-shaped stones, in the bodies of the ancestors, a world where the line between the living, the dead, and the gods was thin and constantly crossed. At the summit of it stood Inti, the sun. Inti was the great god of the ruling family, the divine father of the Sapa Inca, the giver of warmth and of the harvest. His was the golden temple at the heart of Cusco. His was the great festival, Inti, held at the winter solstice, when the people begged the sun, at his weakest and most distant, to turn back and come near again. To a people living high in the cold mountains, where the sun's warmth was quite literally the difference between food and famine, this was not abstract worship. It was gratitude and fear aimed at the most powerful thing in their sky. Above and behind Inti, in the thinking of at least some of the Inca, stood an older and vaster figure. Viracocha, the creator, the one who had made the world and the sun and the first people, and then withdrawn to the edges of things. Below and around them was a whole world of lesser powers, the Huacas, a word for the countless sacred things and places that fill the land. A huaca might be a mountain peak, a spring, a cave, an unusual rock, a shrine, a battlefield, the mummified body of an ancestor. The Incas saw the sacred woven right through the physical world, and they honored it everywhere, with prayers and offerings of cloth and food and maize beer poured out onto the earth. But the strangest thread in Inca religion to us is what they did with their dead, because for the Inca, the most important dead did not really leave. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was not buried and forgotten. It was preserved, dried and wrapped and kept a mummy in the dry cold air of the mountains that preserves flesh so well. And that mummy was not treated as a corpse. It was treated as though the emperor was still in some sense present. His body kept his palace and his lands and his servants. It was brought out at festivals, seated among the living emperors, carried through the streets, offered food and drink. His descendants spoke to him and asked his advice and answered on his behalf. In the Golden Temple, the preserved bodies of the dead emperors were kept and honored, a line of sitting kings who had died but not departed. This was not morbid to them. It was the opposite. The ancestors were not gone. They were the family's greatest treasure and its living link to the divine, and to keep them, feed them, consult them was the deepest kind of loyalty. A great man did not vanish when he died. He became, if anything, more important, a huaca in his own right, watching over his people from just the other side of a very thin door. You can see in all this how completely the sacred and the practical were braided together. The sun that had to be worshipped was the sun that ripened the maize. The emperor who was a god was the emperor who filled the storehouses. And the dead who were fed and consulted were the same dead whose lands and wealth their descendants still conveniently controlled. It was a whole and coherent way of seeing the world, and within it, the people did things that are hard for us to look at directly, including, at the empire's most solemn moments, the offering we turn to next. I will tell it plainly and briefly and with the seriousness it deserves. Chapter 17, The Mountain Offerings. At the most solemn moments in the life of the empire, the death of a Sapa Inca, the crowning of a new one, a great earthquake, a drought, a threat to the whole people, the Inca made their highest offering. It was called the Capacocha, and it is the hardest thing about them to tell. I am going to tell it simply and with care, because it deserves neither to be hidden nor to be turned into a spectacle. At these times, the empire chose children. They were chosen, in the Inca understanding, for their purity and their perfection, often the sons and daughters of nobles, and to be chosen was held to be a very great honor for the child and for the family, for the child was to be sent to live among the gods themselves. They were brought to Cusco for ceremonies, feasted and honored, and then taken, sometimes on long journeys of many hundreds of miles, to the summits of the highest and most sacred mountains in the empire. And there, on those freezing peaks, at the very roof of the world, in the thin air closest to the sun, The children were given to the gods and left, and they died. We know this not only from the accounts of the time, but because the mountains kept them. High on certain Andean summits, most famously on the summit of a volcano called Lula more than 6,000 meters up, one of the highest resting places on the whole earth. The cold and the dry, thin air have preserved these children almost perfectly across 500 years. On Lula 3 of them were found together, and one, a girl of perhaps 15, whom the world came to call the Maiden, is so untouched by time that she does not look dead at all. Her skin, her hands, the fine dark braids of her hair, even the faint down on her arms remain. She sits wrapped and calm, exactly as she was left, as though she had only fallen asleep on the mountain the night before and might at any moment stir. When people first looked into that unchanged face, the face of a child of the Inca Empire, 5 centuries gone, they had to sit with everything it meant. It is not for us to judge them across 5 centuries with an easy heart, nor to pretend it was anything other than what it was. To the Inca, this was the most sacred act they could perform, the giving of what was most precious, a perfect child, up to the gods on whom the whole world depended at the moment of greatest need. It came from the same place as everything else we have seen, a total belief that the sacred and the survival of the people were one thing, and that the greatest crises demanded the greatest gifts. It is a window hard to look through into just how completely the Inca lived inside their faith. We will leave the high peaks now and their sleeping children and come back down to the green ridges, to the single most famous place the empire ever built, and to the truth about it. Chapter 18, Machu Picchu. Now, at last, we come to the postcard, to the grey stone city on the green ridge, wrapped in cloud, that is the one image nearly everyone in the world carries of the Inca, Machu Picchu. And because it is so famous, there is more untruth attached to it than to almost anything else the Inca made. So let us go there carefully and see what is real. Machu Picchu sits high on a saddle of rock between 2 peaks, above a loop of a rushing river, deep in the steep cloud forest on the eastern edge of the mountains, where the Andes begin to fall away toward the Amazon. It is a small place, as cities go, a few hundred buildings of the fine-fitted Inca stone, terraced fields cut into the slopes around it, temples and houses and fountains fed by channels of running water, all balanced on a ridge so sheer it hardly seems possible. It is, without argument, one of the most beautiful things human beings have ever built, precisely because of how perfectly it belongs to the wild place it stands in. Here is what it was not. It was not a great city, too few people lived there. It was not a fortress or a last refuge, though it is often called both. It was not a lost city, hidden and unknown, waiting through the centuries for someone to find it. What the best evidence tells us is quieter and, I think, lovelier. Machu Picchu was most likely a royal estate, a country retreat built in the middle of the 15th century for Pachacuti, the great emperor who turned the world, and his family. A place away from the crowds and the business of Cusco, where the ruler and his court could come, high and remote and stunningly beautiful, surrounded by temples to the sun and the mountains and the water. A private paradise for the son of the sun, staffed and farmed by people brought there to serve it. When the empire fell and the reason for the place fell with it, Machu Picchu was gradually left and the forests crept back over it. But left is not the same as lost, and this is the part worth holding on to. When the outside world discovered Machu Picchu in the year 1911, when an explorer from Yale named Hiram Bingham was led up the mountain and wrote the account that made it famous around the globe, there were people already there. Local Quechua farming families lived in the valley below and worked some of the old Inca terraces still. A local man guided Bingham up. There were, by some accounts, families actually living among the ruins. The people of the region had never forgotten it. It had simply never left them. The idea of the lost city, the romance of the hidden place found by the daring explorer, was in large part a story built afterward because it was a better story than the truth. And the truth, that Machu Picchu was a beautiful mountain retreat for a great emperor, quietly known to the local people all along, is not a lesser thing. It is only a truer one. It is exactly the kind of small correction this channel exists to make. The legend gently set aside, and the real place, if anything, left more moving than before. Machu Picchu, in the end, is the whole empire made small and set on a ridge. And the emperor who built it, Pachacuti, had a great-grandson under whom the empire reached its widest extent and its first unseen wound. Chapter 19, Huayna Qhapaq and the Coming Shadow. By the end of the 15th century, Tawantinsuyu had reached almost its full size. Pachacuti's son had carried the armies far to the south and north. Now his great-grandson, a ruler named Huayna Qhapaq, pushed the borders further still, campaigning for years in the far north, in the green highlands of what is now Ecuador, adding new lands and peoples to an empire already too vast for the mind to hold. Huayna Qhapaq spent much of his reign in the north, so much that he built there a second great center, at Quito, and came to love the northern country. And here, without anyone in the empire understanding what they were seeing, the shadow that would destroy Tawantinsuyu fell across it, years before a single European ever set foot in the mountains. Far to the north, on the other side of a continent the Inca did not know existed, strangers had landed. The Spanish had come to the Caribbean and to the coasts of Central America, and though none of them had yet reached the Andes, something they carried had gone on ahead of them. Disease. The peoples of the Americas had lived for thousands of years cut off from the illnesses that had swept the rest of the world, and they had almost no resistance to them. Smallpox, and perhaps others moving from person to person, from village to village, along the trade routes and the very roads the Inca had built, ran south through the Americas faster than any messenger, faster than the men who had brought it, until it reached the empire in the mountains. And it killed. It killed on a scale that is hard to take in. Whole communities sickened and died in a season. And somewhere around the year 1527, in the north, the sickness reached the emperor himself. Huayna Qhapaq fell ill and died, and with him, in the same wave, died the son he had chosen to follow him, a young man named Ninanquyuchi, the intended heir. Consider what has just happened at the worst possible moment. The empire had no fixed, unbreakable law of succession, no clear rule that the eldest son simply inherits. The throne passed to the son judged most fit, and that judgment in practice could be fought over. And now, in a single stroke, the disease had killed both the emperor and the heir he had named, and left the succession open, and left the empire leaderless, frightened and grieving, its people dying by the thousand of a horror they had never seen and could not explain. Into that opening stepped two brothers, and the empire, which no outside army had ever managed to break, began to tear itself apart from the inside. Chapter 20. Two Brothers. When Huayna Qhapaq and his chosen heir died together of the sickness, they left behind other sons, and two of them now reached for the empty throne. One was Huáscar, who was in Cusco, the ancient capital, the sacred center, and who was recognized there among the old nobility in the city of the sun as the rightful Sapa Inca. The other was Atahualpa, who had been with their father in the north through the long campaigns and who had at his side the great veteran armies of the northern wars and their hardened, loyal generals, Cusco and its legitimacy on one side, the army and the north on the other. It is an old and terrible equation, and it resolved, as it so often has, into war. The civil war between the two brothers tore through the empire for several years, and it was savage. These were not border skirmishes, they were the full armies of Tawantinsuyu turned against each other, and the fighting killed on a vast scale, and it split the loyalties of the whole empire down the middle. Provinces and peoples were forced to choose a side. The machinery of the state, the roads, the storehouses, the labor, the soldiers, was turned inward against itself. And the peoples the Inca had conquered and absorbed and resettled, the ones held in the empire by force and by clever arrangement rather than by love, watched the masters of the mountains destroy one another and drew their own conclusions. In time, Atahualpa's northern armies and their generals won. Huáscar was defeated in battle, captured, and his cause broken. Atahualpa's forces moved on Cusco itself. By the early months of the year 1532, Atahualpa had triumphed. He was the master of the empire, or about to be, the last man standing in a war between brothers. But look at the empire he had won. It had just buried its emperor and its heir to a plague no one understood. It had just spent years bleeding itself white in a civil war. It was exhausted, divided, full of provinces that had backed the losing side and peoples who had never wanted to be Inca at all. Atahualpa himself, victorious, was still in the north, near a mountain town called Cajamarca, resting his armies, his hold on the reunited empire only days old, and not yet secure. And it was at exactly this moment, the empire wounded, split, grieving, its new master not yet crowned in Cusco, that word came to Atahualpa of something strange. A small band of foreigners had landed on the coast and were moving up into the mountains toward him. Bearded men, pale-skinned, unlike anyone the empire had ever seen. There were fewer than 200 of them. Atahualpa, with an army of many thousands at his back, at the head of the greatest empire in the Americas, had no reason on earth to fear so tiny a company of strangers. He agreed to meet them. He was curious he would receive them at Cajamarca. It is one of the most fateful decisions in all of history. Chapter 21. Cajamarca. The strangers were led by a man named Francisco Pizarro. He was not a great lord, he was a hard, aging, ambitious Spanish soldier from a poor background who had spent years in the Americas chasing rumors of a rich kingdom in the mountains, and who had now, with royal permission and everything he could borrow, come to find it. His whole company numbered fewer than 200 men, something like 168, with a few dozen horses, some steel swords and armor, and a handful of primitive guns. Against them stood the empire, and Atahualpa's army, tens of thousands strong. By every ordinary measure, it was no contest at all. And that is exactly why what happened is so hard to believe. The Spanish reached Cajamarca and found the town all but empty. Atahualpa was encamped outside it with his army. Pizarro, seeing the odds, made a desperate and ruthless plan. He hid his men in the buildings around the town's great square, and he invited the emperor to come in and meet him. On the afternoon of the 16th of November, in the year 1532, Atahualpa came. He came in state, carried high on a litter of gold, dressed in the splendor of the sun, surrounded by thousands of his people. But they came, most of them, as a magnificent procession, not as an army ready for battle. Why would they be? He was the master of the world, coming to look at a handful of exhausted foreigners. He had nothing to fear. What followed was over almost before it began. A Spanish priest approached the emperor and, through an interpreter, spoke to him of a foreign god and a foreign king across the sea and offered him a holy book. Atahualpa, who had never seen a book and owed nothing to any king, examined it and let it fall. And that, the emperor's rejection, his hand releasing the book, was the signal the Spanish had been waiting for. Pizarro gave the order. The hidden guns fired into the packed crowd. The horsemen, animals the Inca had never seen, burst out from cover into the square with steel and terror. The armored Spanish fell on a crowd that was not armed for war and could not run, hemmed into the square. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. In the chaos and the smoke and the screaming, the Spanish cut their way through the emperor's people straight to the litter, and they seized Atahualpa himself and pulled the son of the sun down into their hands. In a single afternoon, without losing a man, 168 strangers had captured the master of the greatest empire in the Americas. Now, how? This is the promise we made at the very beginning, and it deserves an honest answer, because the honest answer is not, the strangers were simply better men. It is many things at once. Some of it was the shock of the utterly unknown, horses, guns, steel, none of which the Inca had ever faced, all arriving at once in a storm of noise and blood. Some of it was the reckless, calculated boldness of Pizarro, who staked everything on a single ambush and won. But the deepest reasons were the ones we have already watched unfold. The empire had just been gutted by a plague that killed its emperor and threw its succession into chaos. It had just torn itself apart in a civil war between two brothers, and the wounds were days old. It was full of conquered peoples who had no love for the Inca and were willing, many of them, to help the strangers against their masters, and without those tens of thousands of native allies, the Spanish could never have held what they seized. And with the god emperor himself taken alive, a state built entirely around the sacred person of the Sapa Inca was left in an instant with its head in the enemy's hands and no clear body to act without it. The strangers did not defeat the Inca Empire that afternoon. They caught it at the one moment in its short life when it was already broken, and they closed their hands around its heart. What came next was the long, slow falling of everything else. Chapter 22: The Long Fall. With Atahualpa in their hands, the Spanish held the empire by its center. And the captive emperor, understanding at last what these men wanted above all things, made them an offer that has echoed ever since. He offered to fill a room with treasure. He would give then, for his freedom, a great chamber filled once with gold and twice over with silver, the ornaments and vessels and sacred plate of the empire gathered from across the mountains. It is one of the most famous ransoms in history, and the Inca kept their side of it. For months the treasure came, carried in on the backs of llamas and men from every corner of Tawantinsuyu, the golden gardens and temple walls and holy things of an empire, brought to Cajamarca and melted down by the Spanish into bars. A room filled with gold, the accumulated sacred wealth of a civilization, poured into ingots. And when the ransom was paid, the Spanish killed him anyway. Fearing his armies, needing him gone, they put Atahualpa on trial on charges that were barely even a pretense, and in the year 1533, they executed the last independent Sapa Inca of a united empire. The son of the sun died a prisoner, and the gold that was to have bought his life had already been melted into money. What followed was not one clean conquest, but a long, grinding collapse. The Spanish marched on Cusco and took the sacred city itself. They tried to rule through puppet emperors, princes of the Inca line raised up to wear the crown and do as they were told. But the Inca did not simply lie down. One of these puppet rulers, a young prince named Manco Inca, turned on the Spanish and raised a great rebellion, and for a time laid siege to Cusco with an enormous army and very nearly drove the strangers out of the mountains altogether. The old empire, even broken, even bleeding, made the invaders fight for every stone. But the wounds were too deep, and the sickness kept killing, and the divisions the Spanish exploited never healed. Manco Inca's rebellion failed. He withdrew with his followers into the wild, forested mountains to the northwest, to a remote refuge called Vilcabamba, and there, in the deep country beyond Spanish reach, the Inca kept a small, free, shadow empire alive for another generation, a last flame of Tawantinsuyu burning in the jungle. It could not last. In the year 1572, the Spanish mounted a final expedition into the wilderness, took Vilcabamba, and captured the last independent Inca ruler, a young man named Qhapaq Ñan. They brought him back to Cusco, to the great square at the heart of the sacred city, and before a crowd that is said to have wept and cried out at the sight, they executed him. With his death, 40 years after Cajamarca, the line of the sons of the sun that stretched back to the legend of Manco Qhapaq came, at last, to its end. The empire that had risen in a single lifetime took rather longer to die, but it died. Chapter 23. What Remains? It is easy, when an empire falls, to imagine that it simply ends, that the story closes and the mountains go quiet. But that is not what happened here, and it is the wrong note to end on. Because the strange, moving truth about the Inca is how much of them is still alive. Start with the language. Quechua, the tongue the Inca spread across their empire as the language of the state, did not die with the state. It is spoken today by millions of people across Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador and beyond, one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in all of the Americas. When you hear it in a market in the high mountains today, you are hearing, in a real sense, the empire still speaking. Walk through the Andes now, and you will find the terraces still climbing the hillsides, many of them still farmed, still holding the soil against the rain, exactly as they were built to do. You will find the potato in its hundreds of Andean varieties, and you will find chuño, still made the old way, with the frost and the sun and the treading of feet. You will find the descendants of the people who wove the grass bridges, rebuilding one of them every single year by hand across the same gorge, keeping alive a knowledge 5 centuries old. You will find in the old walls of Cusco, Inca stones still standing dead level and true beneath the buildings raised on top of it, having outlasted the earthquakes that brought the newer walls down. And you will find the cords in museums and in a few remote villages that have guarded them for generations. The Quipu survive, thousands of them, knotted strings still holding the census and the accounts and, perhaps, the words of an empire, waiting. And there are people right now patiently trying to read them, to work out, knot by knot and color by color, what the Inca wrote down in the one script the world was never quite sure was a script at all. The last chapter of the Inca has genuinely not been written because we are, slowly, still learning to read the first ones. That is why we remember them, not only for the gold, which was melted down and is gone, not only for the tragedy of Cajamarca, though it is one of the great tragedies of history. We remember the Inca because they answered an impossible question. How do you feed, connect, and hold together 10 million people along the longest mountains on earth with no writing, no wheel, no iron, and no money? And they answered it so well that the mountains still carry the shape of their answer. An empire that lasted in its full glory for less than a single human lifetime and left marks that have outlasted everything raised over them since. They built for the ages in a world that gave them almost nothing to build with, and much of it is still standing. In the end, that is the quiet triumph underneath the tragedy, and it is a good thing to carry with you into sleep. Subscribing and by leaving a like. It is the simplest thing, and it is what lets these long, calm nights keep coming. Sleep well. Rest easy. And I will see you next week for another quiet history.